This conference will now be recorded.
Alright, so this is the pipeline that we were using yesterday. So I have two pipelines right now. One is my infrastructure, meaning one is the DevOps. The other is, let's say, the developers, meaning whoever is the development team who was working on. The other is the development team. And from the DevOps artifact, meaning from this pipeline, I am able to produce, sorry, I am able to produce something called as an ARM template. So if you look into the published artifact, this is going to give you an ARM web app.json. From the .NET Core pipeline, which is the code, I am able to produce a .zip file. So this is code and this is infrastructure. What I did is that I now started combining these two things together, took it to the release pipeline, and in the release pipeline, what I did is that I went ahead and added two things out here. One is my code, the artifact coming from my code pipeline. The other is the artifact coming from the infrastructure pipeline. Now, what is the difference between these two? Are these two doing the same thing? Not really. They're not. They're not really doing the same thing out here, but rather my infrastructure artifact is providing me with the JSON file, which helps me create the resource group and the web app automatically. This is automation. Whereas this task uses the code artifact, the .zip, and releases the code on this web app that's been created automatically. So without this artifact, I won't be able to achieve this task. Without the artifact coming from, let's say, the infrastructure pipeline, I won't be able to achieve this particular task out here. So if I'm not able to achieve this task will fail because it's trying to deploy on top of a web app which doesn't exist. So this will create or this will lay down the infrastructure. This will inject the code on top of the infrastructure. This is the two main difference between those two pipelines. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, Kiran.
Okay, and any more questions, guys, before we move forward? Okay, so this is what I want today. So I have a development, I have a QA. I have cloned all these pipelines together. So I said it's development, I said it is QA, I said it is prod. So I have three things right now, and I have three different teams involved right now. The development team is coming here, the QA team is coming here, and let's say the business team or the client is coming at this particular phase. Now, what am I essentially doing out here is that I am taking my code, deploying it onto, let's say, the development environment. Then, after this is done, I am promoting it to the QA environment. Then I am promoting it to the production environment. Usually, what happens is this: after the code is deployed to the development environment, the entire development team starts working on the Azure resource group and the Azure web app that got created with the code inside it right now, and they will start conducting different tests. They'll try to basically see, or they'll try to tell that if the web application is good, or they'll try to see what are the bugs and they'll try to identify. This is something that the development team is going to do. and the development team is somehow, or the development team somehow needs to communicate with the QA team. Meaning, if I'm telling there is a QA team, there will be a lead to the QA team, right? So I'll say there is a QA lead who tells that, okay, fine, I will own this environment, meaning the owner of the environment called QA. Now, how will the developer even tell them that, you know what, the code is good, we are going to promote it? Or how will the QA say, you know what, okay, fine, I have to now take a decision to take this code into the QA environment? Meaning, if I trigger this pipeline, if I create a release, the code is moving from here to here, here to here, and I don't have a control on the movement. Meaning, the code is automatically getting triggered between one stage to the other. So it's going from development to QA, QA to prod. I don't have a control on whether the code should go into QA or whether the code shouldn't go into QA and etc. Now, in order to control this flow, we have something called as approvals. This buttons that sorry, this buttons that you see here are called approvals. The one that comes in front is called a pre-deployment approval. Meaning, what exactly happens out here is this. If I go here and click this button called pre-deployment conditions, there is firstly something known as triggers. I'll come to that in a second. There is something called as pre-deployment approvals. I'll select this and I'll add this person called RBAC contributor at the gmail.com, imagining that imagining that this person here is the lead for the development team. I'll say development team lead. Now this person is the lead for the development team, so I'll just save this out. I'll say added a pre-deployment approval, and whenever now I create a release, and I'll say create, the release 5 has been created, and in here it won't directly go into the development environment. This is something that I wanted to achieve, is that before going into the Azure portal, the lead of that particular environment, meaning the lead of that particular team, should come here and click on the approve button, because this lead should be in a place to decide whether he wants to take the code or whether he doesn't want to take it. This is something that the lead has to decide doing. From my end, as a DevOps engineer with this ID, I just cannot go ahead and approve this out. I just have cancel, I just have, let's say, logs and etc. I have an override approval. If I click on this, I can override it because I am the administrator. I can override it. But we as DevOps engineers generally do not override this out. Rather, we wait for the, let's say, that particular person to come in and approve it out. Meaning that particular person is nothing but a lead of the development team who is now in a position to understand whether I should take the code or I should take this change or I should take the infrastructure and etc. So I'm saying just sign into Azure DevOps and I'll just sign in, let's say, the particular ID. So I'll say it is RBAC contributor, and once I log in, should be able to see a pipeline which is waiting for my approval, and only when I, as a lead of the development team, goes ahead and approves this out, that's where the code will start getting, or the code will start moving into the environment. See, now it's waiting for my approval. If I go here, I have the approve button. So I'll say clicking in the code, something like this. Give a proper reason and I'll say approve. Only after this is done, and if I just refresh this at my end, now it is queued. The approval has been given, and now the agent job has been started. So the very first thing that will happen is that the approval will be provided. This has to be provided. Only then the code will start moving into the environment. These are called pre-deployment approvals because they're happening before your deployment. Now let me cancel this. Let me do one thing. Let me allow this release to go in, and this will now move, or this will now start moving from development to QA, again from QA to prod. It'll start creating applications, it'll start deploying the application. So it's going to create the infrastructure and then it's going to start deploying on top of the infrastructure. Now here is the ask from from the lead of the development team is that as and when the code deployment in the infrastructure is done, don't promote it to the next environment. Don't do a code promotion to the next environment. Rather wait for us to test it out so that we can test it out and tell the QA lead that you know what, we are good. Meaning you have given a pre-deployment condition wherein you are saying that okay fine, before actually going ahead and taking this code, before actually going ahead and let's say taking the code in, you're getting the approval from let's say the lead of the development team, which is good. But even after taking it, we need the code to stop, meaning I don't need it to be promoted directly to the QA without me as a lead of a development team giving an approval. So this is where post deployment approval comes into picture. So I just say cancel this pipeline out. I'll just say edit pipeline, and this is where post deployment approval condition comes into picture, wherein I am now adding an approval. I'm now saying okay fine, you know what, again the same person, since this is the only person that I have, and this will be a developer, or this will be the lead of a development team to give a post deployment check. What does a post deployment condition mean, or what does a post deployment approval mean here? Is that we have taken the code, we have taken the infrastructure, and we have tested the changes. Meaning, whatever code has come in, we have tested it out thoroughly, we have tested it out in and out. We are good, and we are now going to give you an approval. Is what the development team is telling to the QA team. Now, like the development team, the QA team should also have a let's say a control over what they or what they accept, right? Because this is something, this is the environment what is owned by the QA team. Now the QA team will decide that okay fine, should I take it or not? And that's when you will have a pre-deployment condition for the QA also. So pre-deployment conditions. So let me close this trigger and let me again put a pre-deployment approval. Let me get in the same person out here. And also the QA will also have a post-deployment condition wherein the lead should go ahead and give an approval after they have tested it out. Finally, in the production stage, which is very, very important, here is where your client will come into picture and say, you know what, I will approve it. This is where your client is actually going to come into picture. So in this place, you have the development team lead. So I'll say dev lead. Even here it is dev lead. Here it is the QA lead will come into picture. Again in here, post deployment condition, it is QA lead. And finally, in production environments, you have the client coming into picture.
yeah,
You'll very importantly have the client come into picture, and this is a very important stage because as and when you deploy things on this environment, this will get started getting reflected to every user who's using your application. So every user who's using an
yeah,
application will now be able to see this particular change out here. So before taking the code into this
yeah,
particular environment, it is very important for us to seek an approval or ask our client that are you okay to take this code now? Are we good to take this code right now? Is something that you need to ask your client, and only after that you will have to go ahead and say okay fine, or only after that the code will go ahead and get deployed on top of this particular environment out here.
yeah,
So these are called pre and post deployment approvals. So are we getting this, guys? Is this okay? It's pretty straightforward concept, isn't it? But this is very efficient, and you will be using this concept very much in your real-time environments. Now, why am I telling very much in your real-time environments? Is because we as DevOps engineers, we need to set up these pipelines, meaning we need to set up these pipelines from the scratch. So whenever we are setting this, we need to ask questions, or whoever is giving us the task to set this up, we need to ask important questions to them that do we need pre-deployment approvals? Do we need
yeah,
post-deployment approvals? Also,
yeah,
should the code move from development to QA and then to prod, or should it be something like first QA and sorry, first QA and then development and then to production? What is the order in which we need to juggle this out? Again, if someone tells you, okay, fine, this is not the order, you'll have to change it. It has to be first QA, then development, finally prod. How do you
yeah,
change the order? Is something like this. Now, if I look at this, if I click on this, there is pre-deployment approval conditions what we just set up for approvers to come into picture. There's something known as triggers. And in this trigger, there is by
yeah,
default a trigger called after release that got selected, meaning
yeah,
this is the release. This is the release. This is called as a release phase. As and when this get triggers, the code will automatically move into this particular environment called development. What if I change it?
yeah,
What if I say manual?
yeah,
Sorry. As and when I do manual, the link between these two got broke. There was a link between these two that's no longer there. Meaning this stage called development will not get triggered as
yeah,
and when the release is created. It won't get triggered as and when the release is created.
yeah,
It's a manual approach, meaning I have to, as let's say a DevOps engineer, or as let's say the lead of a development team, should go ahead and click on deploy here, meaning this is what is going to happen right now. So if I save this, I'll say this is manual, and if I say create
yeah,
release, see this is in a white color,
yeah,
this is blue, this is blue. The ash color means this is a manual deployment. The blue color here means that these are configured for a continuous deployment trigger. These are automatic in nature.
yeah,
Meaning what exactly happens is that if I say create,
yeah,
release 6 has been created, and it will now ask me to go ahead and manually click on this button called deploy. The code did not move directly from here to this stage. Earlier it was doing like that, it was behaving like that, but I now changed the nature. So I need to click on deploy here. I need to click on that particular deploy button here.
yeah,
After that, the code is going to move from one environment to the other. Now what's going to happen is that if I say deploy, and if I now do a deploy here, This will now go into the development phase, and it's now going to basically stop here and it says, you know what, I see that there is an approval condition. Can the development lead please go ahead and give an approval? So if I come here as a development lead, I have the release 6 basically. I have the approve button. So I'm logging in, I've logged in with this particular ID and I'm saying approve this out. Once approved, your code will now start getting deployed onto a stage called development. And once this is done, now if you look at the stage, the first thing it did is that it asked you for the approvals. It asked you for the approvals, and once you got the approvals, it's going ahead and doing its own thing, meaning it's going ahead creating the infrastructure using the ARM template, deploying the code, and once this is done, it will wait here for post deployment approval. This is the flow right now. It will wait here for a post deployment approval, and after the post deployment approval is received, this will now basically directly go into the QA and wait there for a pre deployment approval, because right now you have now a pre deployment approval condition in the QA environment as well, that this particular person needs to come here and approve it out. Finally, after this is done, it will go and wait for the production. It will wait for the approval in the production environment out here. Now, that's what I did, or that's what happened when I changed this to manual. But what if I want to, let's say, tell this pipeline that, you know what, it's not the development which is first, it is the QA which is first. Then how do I alter this change, or how do I incorporate this particular change? Is that if I click here, okay, on the pre-deployment condition, we forget about the pre-deployment condition for a second. I have something called as triggers. In here, there is after release. If I click on this, the pipeline is going to get changed something like this. So after release, it's going in there, and this is manual. And if I now click on this, and I'll say triggers, and I'll say after stage, and I will now select the QA. So now it's telling, okay, fine, you know what? After QA, it is directly going to go into the development and also the production, because the production is also configured, was also configured to trigger after the QA. So I am playing around with my pipeline right now. And if I now say, click on this button, if I say after stage, and if I select not the QA but the development, I'm going to arrange my pipeline in an order. So you can now change the order of your pipeline. You can rearrange the order of your pipeline depending upon what your client needs and depending upon what your business requirement really needs. Usually, it is the flow of the pipeline is from a development environment to the QA. Then you'll have something like staging, integrations, and etc. After then comes production. So production is usually the last environment. Development is usually the first environment. So you can play around with your pipeline by clicking on these buttons and see what each and everything means. You can see what after release means. You can see what after stage means. You can see what manual means. You can sorry, you can be playing with all of these things out here by using this option known as triggers out here. So once you play around with these triggers, you'll now come to know how these things basically are juggled around, how these things are, let's say, rearranged, regrouped, and all that stuff. Any questions till here, guys? Anyone, anything till here? Anyone, any questions? And now if you see, the pipeline got triggered in the development state and it's waiting for a pending approval. So it's waiting for a post deployment approval. And once the the lead, meaning once the development lead comes ahead and approves this out, it will go into QA and it will wait for the approval from the QA lead. This is how the pipeline is going to move from one stage to the another. Any questions till here, guys? Anyone, anything till here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. There is one more concept out here, which is called reusability. Now, I'm a huge fan of this because we use this a lot. What do I mean by reusability out here is that, let me go into one of the pipelines, and I have this stage
Yeah.
wherein I am saying create the infra, then I am saying okay, fine, deploy the code on top of the infra. This is one pipeline in your project. Now you want the same set of tasks, the same set of things to be happening
Yeah.
in a different pipeline. Meaning you have
Yeah.
also the ASP.NET core application, right? I mean ASP.NET full framework application, isn't it? Even that application should follow the similar kind of an infrastructure, should follow the similar kind of an approach and etc. All of these things should be the same. So I need to create another release pipeline
Yeah.
for ASP full framework application because this application or this web app
Yeah.
is taking the code for .NET Core. So if I have to do that, then I will have to say new release pipeline, and firstly I will give all my artifacts. So I will need the build pipeline for the ASP.NET full framework. So which is this one.
Yeah.
And I'll say add, and I also
Yeah.
need the build pipeline for the infrastructure. Two things out here. So this is something that I need to add for sure. Secondly, I need different environments like development, QA, and etc. And each and every environments, I need to manually add this particular task called create infra, this particular task called app service deploy, and they have like a lot of variables with them because this
Yeah.
tasks will only work if these variables are in place, which is called environment, which is called web app name, and a lot of things out here. Meaning, if I need to create this pipeline successfully, if I need to make sure to create this pipeline successfully, I need to make sure to replicate these tasks, which is create infra, app
Yeah.
service deploy, and etc. As of now, these are only two tasks, which is manageable.
Yeah.
But when you start working in the real-time environments, it's not going to be two, but it's going to rather be 20 or 30 tasks basically that you need to make sure to replicate across different pipelines in your same in the project. Like you have a project, I am using a project called a 7 a.m. class project out here, and in this project I need multiple pipelines which needs these two
Yeah.
tasks out here. Now, in order to make sure that these are absolutely reusable, both the tasks and the variables. In my case, I have a variable called ASP name, environment, and etc. So on and so forth. All these are good enough, but there are about
Yeah.
6 or 7 variables that I declared out here. In the real-time environment, you'll actually have 70, 80 variables basically that you declare, which you might need to reuse, which you might basically need to, I mean, which you might need to reuse and all that stuff. So what I will do in order to induce some kind of a reusability, I will click on this task. I'll select that below one and I'll do a right click and I'll say create a task group. This is what I'm going into, a concept called as task groups.
Yeah.
What do you mean by a task group? Is that you can add multiple tasks inside one particular task group and make it as a template. Meaning if I now say create a task group out here and I'll say this is the task group name is something like infra creation.
Yeah.
This is the name of the task
Yeah.
group, and I have all these variables called ASP name, RG name, web app name, which the task group actually relies upon. I'll say create. Now I have this task group in place, which is called infra creation right now, which got created. and it can be seen here
Yeah.
in this particular option known as task groups out here, which is going to
Yeah.
which is going to give you an option to interact with these task groups out here. So if I go in here called task groups, I am now able to see something called as infra creation, which I just created. What I can do is that in my new pipeline, in the pipeline that I'm creating in a new way, I can go ahead and I can say add a stage. I'll say
Yeah.
empty job, and this stage is called, let's say, development. And in development, you can go ahead and now add a task group inside of a task. So if I say infra creation,
I'm done.
just refresh this page for a couple of times because this needs to get refreshed. Now, if you see,
Yeah.
instead of a task, I'm adding a task group inside my stage, which is making sure to call this entire tasks out here that's got created. So if I go inside this task group, there are two tasks. Let's say in a real time you have 20. Whenever I add this task group to a pipeline, all those 20 tasks
Yeah.
are called inside this. It's now going to say, okay, fine, these are like 20 different tasks which I've called, and that's it. I don't have to basically go ahead and let's say keep them adding and adding all over again. So this is my .NET full framework pipeline.
I'm
So
done.
I'll say this full framework. I'll say release. I'll save this out. But this pipeline also relies
Yeah.
upon things like what is the environment, what is, let's say, different things like the site. I mean, different things like, let's say, maybe this is not site healthcare. This is, let's say, ASP site healthcare USEs2 because this is ASP.NET full framework application out here, and everything else is good enough. Now, I want to also make sure
Yeah.
that these variables are usable,
Yeah.
meaning I have a set of variables that I've declared called environment. I said ASP name and all that stuff. I want these variables also to be, let's say, reusable because whenever I create a pipeline, I don't want to keep adding variables out here. That's a similar concept what I followed in the
I'm done.
pipeline. Whenever I create a new pipeline, I don't want to keep
Yeah.
adding different tasks in it, but I want to club all those tasks together into
Yeah.
something known as a task group. And I just want to add my task group. Let me close this out. I just want to go ahead and add my task group out here. In the same way, there is a concept known as library, or also known as
I'm done.
variable group,
Yeah.
called variable groups. What
Yeah.
is the advantage of a variable group? Is this. Let me go here. Now, these are all the variables that I require for a successful release. These are all the things that I require for a successful release out here. So what I'm going to do out here is that I'll say in my library, I'll just go ahead and add, and I'll say this is common library,
Yeah.
and I will say things like environment. And in my case, the first environment was development, and I'll say dev. And there is something called as the plan name.
I'm done.
So I'll say there is ASP plan,
Yeah.
and now I'll say the plan name is
Yeah.
something like dollar environment, whatever I declared, and then it is plan 01. And then the name of the web app follows the same convention.
I'm done.
So I'll say web app name
Yeah.
is nothing but environment,
Yeah.
and then something like this one. So whatever I declared on the pipeline is something that I'm now declaring on something known as the variable group.
I'm done.
And finally, I have an RG name.
Yeah.
I'll again say the RG name is dollar environment
Yeah.
and RG. So whatever I declared on the pipeline is something that I'm now able to declare on the library or the variable group, and I'll save it. Now what happens with this is that I can get rid of
Yeah.
declaring these variables on each and every pipeline. Meaning I can just delete them out.
Yeah.
I don't need them, but rather I can go into something known as variable groups. These are pipeline variables which are only applicable to this pipeline. But now what I'm doing is that I made these variables, or I declared that
Yeah.
these variables are not local variables, they are global variables. There are two things that
Yeah.
basically that we're doing out here. One thing is one thing is called a local variable concept, wherein the variables are only applied to this particular release or to this particular pipeline called .NET Core Release Pipeline. This is the only pipeline which can use the variables if you declare it here.
Yeah.
But what if I say I go into variable groups
Yeah.
and I now say link variable group? I have this called common library, and this is for a development stage, guys, because if you look at this variable, I said the name of the environment is dev. So it was a development. So I'll say it is like common library hyphen dev,
Yeah.
make it more clear. And if I go here
Yeah.
and just move this out and again say link variable group, I have common library hyphen dev. I can select this out and I can say the stage to which this particular library gets applied to is called a development stage.
Yeah.
A development stage, and I'll link this variable group out here.
Yeah.
I can now have a similar library with the only value that gets changed is QA, because this is the only thing that needs to change from one environment to the other. So do I have to create again and again? Do I have to create one more library? No. You can just click on this option called clone. There is an option here called clone out here,
Yeah.
wherein you can make a copy of your entire library, or wherein you can make a copy of your entire variable group. So if I say clone, I have a copy appended, so I'll just remove all these things and I'll say QA, and I'll say the environment here is QA. Save this out. I also have production, so I'll do a clone,
Yeah.
and now I'll say this is prod. The environment here is prod.
Yeah.
I'll save this out right now, and let me go into my .NET Core release pipeline. I removed all my pipeline variables. Now I'll just have to link my prod to prod and QA to QA. So all I'm doing right now is a linking
Yeah.
for a pipeline called .NET Core Release.
Yeah.
So I am now making sure to link this out, save it out here, because this pipeline for to be successful needs all these variables out here. And now when you are creating this particular pipeline called full framework release, even this needs the same variables, right? I don't have to add it here again.
Yeah.
I can just go into this particular pipeline as well. I can link the
Yeah.
same group again, meaning I can reuse my variables again. So this gives me a capability to do a lift and shift approach, meaning in the same project, I will be now using a combination of task groups and libraries
Yeah.
or variable groups together to make sure that I have basically a rich combination, or to make sure that you know what, I can easily juggle around with my tasks. I can easily go ahead and let's say create my tasks with minimal effort. So what we do normally in the real-time environment is that we create one pipeline
Yeah.
which is called as a model pipeline. So what we do is like we create a model
Yeah.
pipeline there before we start with the project. We understand what all needs to be in there, and then we make sure to let's say add the variables and add the task groups wherever and whenever possible, and we reuse these blocks for building different pipelines altogether. So we reuse them again and again in different pipelines, whichever we are creating out, we reuse these out, and we make sure to get in some kind of an automation or some kind of an ease in the creation of pipelines out here. So any questions with these two concepts, guys, on what are variables, what are task groups? So some what we covered till now is pre and post deployment conditions. Like what is the necessity of pre-deployment, what is the necessity of post-deployment conditions, how do they come into picture, how do you change the order of your pipeline. Let's say if you want QA to come first or development to go next, how do you change the order of your pipeline? And finally, we are seeing what is task group and what is libraries, or also known as variable groups out here. So any questions still here, guys?
Yeah.
Anyone, any questions still here? Okay, so then I have a question for you all, and this is a very, very popularly asked interview question. Is that,
Yeah.
let's say you have a pipeline called .NET Core Release, okay? I created this pipeline.
Yeah.
I have a value called environment is equal to dev, right? In this library, which is scoped to something known as a stage, I have a value called environment is equal to dev. If
Yeah.
I go ahead and create a same key value pair called environment, and I'll say this is development, I'll say this is scoped to development,
Yeah.
which is the value do you think will take a
Yeah.
precedence? This is called order of precedence, guys. I have again, so this is the scenario. There is a variable group scoped to the development environment with a key value pair called environment is equal to dev.
Yeah.
There is again a pipeline variable
Yeah.
scoped to this particular phase or scoped to this particular task with a value called environment is equal to development. Now, when Azure DevOps starts to work, or when you trigger a pipeline, which is the value do you think will
Yeah.
get assigned, or which is the value do you think your pipeline will wake up? Is it
Yeah.
dev or is it development? And if it is development, then why it is development? If it is dev, then why it is dev? Yes, guys. So
Mm,
this is your question.
development, Kiran.
Development. Okay. Do you think it is development?
Yeah.
Actually, it is a pipeline variable, so scope will be high
Hmm.
for pipeline variable within the release pipeline.
Okay.
So scope will be less for global, like variable groups. So it
Variable
will
group.
take,
Hmm.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else thinks different, guys? And is everyone able to follow this question? Are we like,
Yeah.
firstly, is everyone able to understand this question, guys? Anyone who did not understand this
Yeah.
question? Okay, so let's see what happens here. So let me do one thing. Let me
Yeah.
disable this task and let me trigger the stage called development. So why am I disabling? I don't need this task to actually go. I just need to understand what my variables are. So I'll say trigger it out. I'm putting everything on manual. I'll say create. Release 7 is created. This release won't do anything. I'll say deploy, and I need someone to approve it. But since this is just a dummy face, I'll just go ahead and override this out. So just give me a refresh. Okay, why am I not able to see the override? Strange. Fine, let me do one thing.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So there is one task that is already pending out here. So
Yeah.
firstly, I'll cancel this out. And once I cancel it out, I have now a pending approval. So I'll just overwrite this out. So I'm going into the phase. I'm going into the task right now.
Angle.
And I'm allowing the agent job to trigger. This is not doing anything. It doesn't have any task to perform.
Yeah.
It'll just go ahead do an initialize of the job, and it will just go ahead and download the artifact. That's the only thing it's going to do. So let's understand what happens here, or let's understand how we troubleshoot this thing out. So I'll go into the initialize job. This is the first step in the release pipeline that actually gets triggered, where Azure DevOps tries to acquire an agent.
Yeah.
A. B. It's going to resolve all the variables that are there in its memory. All the in-memory variables is going to be resolved by Azure DevOps. Now I'll say the variable that I'm interested in something known is known as environment.
Yeah.
Environment has got a variable with the name called development. Environment now is taking a variable called development. This variable is coming from the pipeline variable. So yes, as someone suggested, pipeline variables
Yeah.
scoped to the environment
Yeah.
is always going to take a higher precedence. This is important to understand is that I have a pipeline variable scoped to a particular environment. This will take a priority
Angle.
over the variable group,
Yeah.
over the variable that is there in the variable group, scope to the same environment.
Yeah.
Now I will just turn the situation in a little bit around. So I'll just cancel this out and I'll say yes. I'll turn the situation a little bit around. I'll say edit pipeline. And in here, I will delete this variable.
Angle.
I'll add one more thing called environment.
Yeah.
Same thing. Say development one.
Yeah.
I'll scope it to the release. Please observe what I'm doing. Earlier I had a variable scope to the pipeline, meaning scope to the environment. I now have a variable scope to the release. This variable is called development one.
Angle. Angle.
I have a variable group which has a value called dev. I'll save this pipeline. I'll trigger it
Yeah.
out. I'm creating the release. This is release 8 that I'm creating right now. Deploy this out. What do you now think should be or will be the value of
Angle.
environment?
Angle.
Is it development one or is it dev? Meaning, is it a
Yeah.
pipeline variable or is it a variable group?
Yeah.
Anyone, guys? What should be the value or what should Azure DevOps get the value as?
Angle. Angle.
Anyone?
Yeah.
So it's a guesswork. I'm not asking the right answer.
Yeah.
It's just something that I'm asking you all to guess.
Still pipeline variable development one.
So development one, let's look at that.
Yes, it will be pipeline.
Pipeline variable, let's do that. Let's say again, let's say environment.
Angle. Yeah.
Where is that? Environment is dev.
Yeah.
It's not development one. Confused? It is always the variable, always and always the variable which is scoped to an environment.
Angle. Angle. Yeah.
This will always take a higher precedence than a variable
Yeah.
scoped to the release. What do I mean by this? This variable called environment with a value called development 1 is scoped to the release. So this will take a lesser precedence
Yeah.
than the value coming from the variable group
Yeah.
that is scoped to the environment. So the order of precedence is always this. Pipeline variable firstly scoped to the environment. Next comes variable groups scoped to the environment. Finally, pipeline variables scoped to the release.
Yeah.
And finally, if even Azure DevOps is not able to get this out, it is variable groups scoped to the release. This is how Azure DevOps, or this is the operation mode on what Azure DevOps will go ahead and do this. So pipeline environment, variable group environment, then pipeline variable scope to the release, variable groups also scope to the release. This is called as the order of precedence.
Yeah.
Very, very, very commonly asked, trickiest interview question. Like we try to trick students and ask them, what do you know or what is your understanding about all these things out? So this is called as the order of precedence, guys. This is how you check the order of precedence. This is how we go ahead and understand how, I mean, using a pipeline is where we go ahead and understand what the order of precedence really is. Any questions? Anyone? Any questions? I don't need this. I'll just delete this out. Any questions, guys, before we close?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take that as a no. Then
Yeah.
that's it from mine today, guys. We'll meet tomorrow and we'll need to discuss some more concepts in Azure DevOps. And again, please go ahead and do a quick refresher on ARM templates because we are going to use them again tomorrow. Please make sure to come prepared with ARM knowledge so that we can start building on top of it. Uh, Thank you, guys, and have a great day ahead.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.